For thousands of years, humanity has asked the same haunting question: what happens after we die? Long before modern religions took root, the ancient Egyptians crafted one of the most detailed spiritual guides in human history. A text so profound it served as a manual for the soul's journey through the afterlife. This sacred text is known as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. But contrary to popular belief, it's not a book of death. It's a book of life, transformation, and cosmic rebirth. Whether you're a spiritual seeker, a curious mind, or someone searching for deeper meaning, this story will change how you see life, death, and the soul itself. Let us now journey through the mysteries of this ancient scroll. In the ancient land of Egypt, where golden sands kissed the Nile and the pharaohs ruled as gods among men, a sacred tradition was born, one that would endure for thousands of years and shape humanity's earliest ideas of life, death, and eternity. The Egyptian Book of the Dead was not a book in the modern sense. It had no singular author, no fixed title, and no rigid form. Instead, it was a living tradition, evolving across centuries, passed down from temple to tomb and from scribe to soul. Its earliest form can be traced back over 4,000 years to what scholars call the pyramid texts, inscribed on the inner walls of royal burial chambers during Egypt's Old Kingdom. These inscriptions were reserved for pharaohs, divine kings who were believed to ascend to the heavens and join the gods in the afterlife. The texts were written in hieroglyphs, and their purpose was both spiritual and practical. They served as guides, spells, and incantations meant to help the deceased navigate the perilous journey through the underworld and achieve eternal life. As time passed, this spiritual privilege began to extend beyond king. During the Middle Kingdom around 2100 BCE, the sacred knowledge began appearing inside the coffins of nobles and officials, giving rise to what are now called. This expansion marked a radical shift in ancient Egyptian spirituality. The promise of eternal life was no longer exclusive to royalty. With the right rituals, wisdom, and offerings, even ordinary individuals could aspire to transcend death and become one with the gods. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1550 BCE, the texts began to appear on papyrus scrolls, richly decorated and placed alongside mummies in tombs. This is the version we most often refer to today as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Though the Egyptians themselves called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day, the title reveals a hidden truth. This was not a book about death, but a manual for rebirth, a sacred map that would allow the soul to emerge triumphantly into the light of the next world. These scrolls could stretch over 20 meters long, meticulously handwritten by skilled scribes. Each scroll was unique, tailored to the beliefs, wealth, and desires of the deceased. Some were lavish, illustrated with vivid depictions of gods and trials, while others were simple and modest. But they all served the same purpose: to equip the soul with knowledge, protection, and power in the mysterious world beyond the grave. What makes the Book of the Dead so spiritually profound is its psychological depth and moral insight. It was not just a series of magical spells. It was a mirror for the soul, demanding self-reflection, moral integrity, and inner transformation. In many ways, it resembled a personal diary of spiritual preparation. The deceased would declare their innocence, affirm their values, and appeal to divine beings for safe passage. Yet, despite its name, the Book of the Dead was not a book about finality. It was a celebration of continuity, of life unending. To understand it is to understand how the ancient Egyptians saw existence as a cycle of death and rebirth, a spiral of the soul's journey through darkness into eternal light. Among the most iconic scenes in the Book of the Dead lies the deeply symbolic and emotionally stirring moment of the weighing of the heart, a spiritual trial that every soul must undergo before entering paradise. In this sacred judgment, the deceased would be brought before Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and a court of 42 divine judges. The heart of the deceased, believed to be the seat of emotion, morality, and memory, was placed on one side of a celestial scale. On the other side rested the feather of Mat, the embodiment of cosmic truth, balance, and justice. This was not a metaphorical trial. To the Egyptians, it was very real. The heart would testify silently through its weight, revealing the moral character of the life it once pulsed within. A heart heavy with guilt, lies, cruelty, or betrayal would tip the scale and signal doom. But a heart light and pure, one that had lived in accordance with Maat, would balance or rise, allowing the soul to pass. It had prepared for this trial by studying and reciting one of the most powerful and haunting passages in the Book of the Dead, Spell 125. This section is often called the negative confession, a series of declarations in which the deceased proclaims their innocence from 42 moral offenses. Each declaration is a spiritual sword cutting through potential condemnation. I have not committed sin. I have not robbed. I have not killed. I have not uttered lies. I have not polluted myself. I have not caused pain. I have not acted deceitfully. The confession was not simply a legal defense. It was a statement of identity. A life well lived was the only true passport into the afterlife. Yet the consequences of failure were dire. Should the heart fail to meet the divine standard, it would be devoured by a monstrous deity named Ammit, a creature that combined the deadliest animals known to the Egyptians: crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus. Ammit was not a tormentor, but a final eraser of existence. A soul consumed by her would not suffer forever. It would be forgotten, erased from the cycle of rebirth, and denied the afterlife. But if the soul passed the trial, if the heart was light and the truth within strong, then the path to eternal life opened. The soul would be welcomed into a sacred realm where they could be reunited with loved ones, live among the gods, and find everlasting peace. In this divine drama, the Book of the Dead offered both a warning and a promise that the choices we make in life echo through eternity, and that the soul's greatest power lies not in magic, but in moral courage and inner purity. It is this emphasis on truth, justice, and self-awareness that makes the Book of the Dead so relevant even today. For in the end, the judgment of the heart is not only about death, it is about how we choose to live. Beyond the Hall of Judgment lies a realm that very few dared to imagine in full, and even fewer truly understood: the shadowy, mystical underworld known as the Duat. It was here that the soul, having proven its moral worth, would face a new and terrifying challenge. This realm was not a simple purgatory or waiting room for the blessed. It was a vast and dangerous landscape, filled with demons, trials, gods, and illusions, a mirror of the soul's unconscious fears, desires, and hidden truths. To enter the Duat was to descend into the great unknown, a cosmic labyrinth that stretched across 12 gates or hours, each corresponding to the 12 hours of the night. Just as the sun god Ra journeyed through the Duat each evening, battling the forces of chaos before rising anew at dawn, so too would the soul of the deceased undergo this perilous voyage. But Ra was a god. The soul was vulnerable, exposed, and deeply dependent on the wisdom preserved in the sacred texts, especially the Book of the Dead. The Duat was not a realm of static torment or fire and brimstone. It was a living terrain, constantly shifting, filled with rivers of fire, lakes of darkness, mountains of flame, and halls guarded by serpent-headed monsters and gods with terrifying power. It was a world where nothing was as it seemed. Spirits could be deceived, misled, or trapped forever if they lacked the necessary knowledge, spells, and spiritual insight. This is where the Book of the Dead served its most critical purpose. Within its scrolls were not only the moral declarations of the deceased, but also arcane spells, ritual phrases, and divine passwords needed to navigate the maze of the Duat. Each section offered protection from specific dangers: a spell to calm the crocodile that guards the waterway, another to freeze the knife-wielding demon who blocks the next gate, and yet another to keep one's body intact while the soul journeys forward. These were not symbolic words. To the ancient Egyptians, they were literal tools of survival in a realm that was as real as the world of the living. The Duat was ruled by both gods and monsters, with Osiris reigning as the Lord of the Dead, seated in his throne of judgment. Yet even Osiris could not intervene directly in the soul's journey. The soul had to earn its passage. One of the most feared enemies lurking in this world was Apus, also known as Apep, the great serpent of chaos. Apus represented everything the Egyptians feared: disorder, destruction, eternal night. Every night Ar battled Apus to ensure that the sun would rise again. Likewise, every soul passing through the duat would encounter this force of annihilation, the embodiment of fear, confusion, and oblivion. The Book of the Dead included incantations meant to bind, blind, or repel Apus, invoking the power of the gods to assist the soul in their struggle. Some spells were addressed directly to Ra, asking him to lend his strength. Others were more cunning, using trickery and spiritual fire to ward off the serpent. The deeper meaning of these battles was spiritual. The soul had to confront its own inner chaos, its own shadow, and either overcome it or be consumed by it. At various gates throughout the duat stood divine guardians, beings who would only allow the soul to pass if it could correctly name them. This might sound arbitrary, but to the Egyptians, knowing the true name of a thing was to hold power over it. Each gatekeeper would ask the soul riddles or demand specific phrases of recognition. These were not mere tests of memory, but of spiritual identity. To know the names, the spells, and the divine logic of the universe was to prove that one had studied the mysteries of life and death, that one was ready for transformation. The journey through the duat also challenged the soul to hold on to its spiritual integrity. There were temptations, illusions, false paradises, and spirits who would try to steal your heart or erase your name. In Egyptian belief, to lose one's name was to cease to exist. It was a second death, even more feared than the first. And so, the Book of the Dead was filled with spells that declared, "Let not my name be forgotten. Let not my body decay. Let me pass unseen. Let me speak the names of the gods and walk among them." Some parts of the scrolls even addressed the soul directly, offering reassurance. You shall not be trapped. You shall not be burned. You shall not fall into darkness. You shall rise as the phoenix. You shall pass through the fire and remain whole. The duat in this way was both trial and teacher. It forced the soul to reckon with its attachments, its ignorance, its pride, and its fear. Only those who were humble, wise, and spiritually prepared could pass through it unscathed. But the journey wasn't purely defensive. The soul was also given opportunities to transform, to reclaim lost memories, to access divine knowledge, and to unite with spiritual archetype. In fact, many spells in the Book of the Dead begin with the phrase, "I am," followed by a god's name or an element of the cosmos. I am at the moment of creation. I am the lotus, blooming in the morning. I am the falcon of Horus. I am the flame that purifies the path. This wasn't arrogance. It was spiritual alchemy. The soul, by aligning with higher forces, began to shed its mortal identity and take on the form of the divine. Each challenge in the duat, each monster overcome, was a symbol of inner mastery. Just as Ra emerged each morning reborn, so too could the soul, if it completed the journey, rise again into a new and eternal form. Thus, the duat was not simply a place of terror, but of profound transformation. It was a realm of deep symbolism, where every encounter revealed something about the soul's readiness to evolve. And it is in this dark, sacred place that the soul began to understand the true meaning of life and death, that both were part of the same cosmic rhythm, and that every hardship was a step on the path to divine resurrection. Having passed through the perilous trials of the duat and emerged victorious from the countless battles against chaos and darkness, the soul finally reached the threshold of its ultimate destiny. This was not simply an arrival, but a sacred metamorphosis. The Egyptian Book of the Dead was not merely interested in survival after death. Its highest aim was divinization, the transformation of the soul into something eternal, radiant, and godlike. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not an ending. It was a process, a long, difficult, and often dangerous journey that culminated not in annihilation or rest, but in a kind of cosmic rebirth. This rebirth did not return the soul to its former self, but elevated it into a higher plane of being. The deceased, having passed judgment and overcome the duat, was no longer a mere mortal. They were now referred to as an Osiris, not in metaphor, but in truth. They became one with Osiris, the god of death and resurrection. Osiris, who himself had been killed, dismembered, and resurrected by his sister wife Isis, represented the eternal cycle of death and renewal. To become Osiris was to rise above the confines of the flesh, to enter into the rhythm of the cosmos, and to be granted a form of immortality that was not static, but vibrantly alive. The soul now took on the powers and attributes of the gods. In the spells of the Book of the Dead, the deceased would declare, "I am Osiris. My soul is divine. My limbs are the limbs of the gods. I shine like the stars. I sail with Ra in his solar boat. I rise at dawn. I set at twilight. Am eternal." This declaration wasn't poetic license. It was a profound mystical identity. The soul had become part of the divine machinery of the universe. It could now travel freely across realms. It could join Ra in his sunboat, helping to defeat Apophis and ensure the rebirth of light each day. It could commune with the gods in their celestial palaces. It could take on various forms: a falcon, a lotus, a heron, a shining star, forms that symbolize the soul's new freedom and cosmic integration. But for many souls, the most cherished reward was not the abstract power of the gods, but the entry into a paradise known as the Field of Reeds, or our. This realm was not a vague heaven above the clouds. It was a perfected reflection of life on earth, where all things were in harmony. The Field of Reeds was depicted as a lush, fertile landscape with endless green crops, flowing waters, and radiant light. In this paradise, the soul could reunite with ancestors, live without suffering, and enjoy the fruits of a just life forever. Here, the labor of farming continued, but without hardship. Food was abundant, time was endless, and the soul lived in peace, surrounded by beauty and serenity. Some spells in the Book of the Dead even described the soul planting and harvesting crops, accompanied by magical figurines buried with the dead that would come to life in the afterlife to perform labor on behalf of their master. These helpers ensured that the soul could enjoy eternal leisure and rest while still fulfilling divine duties. What's especially remarkable is how personal this vision was. Each soul's afterlife was crafted to suit their memories, their desires, and their spiritual growth. There was no one-size-fits-all heaven. The gods, in their wisdom, tailored the eternity of each person according to the kind of life they had lived and the spiritual lessons they had learned. The soul was not lost in a sea of bliss. It was recognized, remembered, and loved by the divine order. Yet, the journey didn't end even here. The soul continued to evolve, to gain wisdom, and to take part in the cosmic order. In some texts, the soul was said to be able to visit Earth, watch over loved ones, guide the living, and offer protection to descendants. Death, in the Egyptian imagination, was not a rupture, but a transformation into a higher state of responsibility and connection. The soul, now a divine being, was part of the eternal dance of creation and balance. At the center of all, this was the soul's name, its Ren. To the Egyptians, the name was the essence of a person's being. If the name was remembered, spoken, and honored, the person continued to exist. If the name was forgotten, the soul was at risk of fading into nothingness. That is why so many tombs, temples, and scrolls preserved names in stone and ink to ensure that the soul's legacy endured for all eternity. Even the gods were bound by this truth. In one of Egypt's oldest myths, Isis gains power over the sun god Ra by learning his secret name, proving that even the divine are vulnerable to the loss of identity. This emphasis on the preservation of the self, combined with the soul's ability to transcend and evolve, makes the Egyptian view of the afterlife one of the most psychologically rich and spiritually nuanced in history. Ultimately, the Book of the Dead teaches that the afterlife is not simply a place, but a state of being. It is the result of conscious effort, inner purification, spiritual knowledge, and deep alignment with the divine principles of truth and balance. The soul that achieves this does not merely rest, it radiates. It becomes a light in the cosmos, a whisper in the wind, a presence in the eternal now. And this, above all, was the great promise of the Book of the Dead. Not that death could be escaped, but that through death, one could become more fully alive than ever before. In a world filled with distraction, noise, and the relentless pursuit of material success, it can be easy to dismiss the writings of a civilization that has been gone for over 3,000 years. After all, what could a collection of ancient texts possibly teach us in the modern age? Why should a spiritual seeker, or anyone in search of truth and meaning, concern themselves with a book about death written by people who worshipped falcon-headed gods and buried their kings in pyramids? And yet, the more one studies the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the clearer it becomes. This ancient guide was not just about preparing for the afterlife. It was about how to live a meaningful life here and now. At its core, the Book of the Dead is a spiritual mirror. It does not simply offer magic words to chant when you die. It asks you again and again, who are you really? What choices have you made? Have you lived a life in harmony with truth, justice, and compassion? Or have you allowed your heart to become heavy with falsehood, cruelty, and selfish desire? These are not questions for the dead. These are questions for the living. And that is precisely why this book still matters. Unlike many spiritual texts that focus on the divine as something external, a god in the sky, a savior to follow, the Egyptian Book of the Dead urges the reader to look inward. It teaches that the journey through the underworld is not merely a literal path after physical death, but a symbolic journey each soul must take during life. A journey through fear, uncertainty, transformation, and rebirth. It tells us that the real enemies are not monsters with crocodile heads, but the inner forces of chaos within us, our greed, our dishonesty, our ignorance. When the soul recites the negative confession, declaring, I have not stolen, I have not murdered, I have not caused pain, it is performing an act of self-inquiry. The ancient Egyptians were essentially asking themselves, what would happen if I stood before the ultimate truth and had to answer for everything I've done? In a modern context, this is equivalent to a deep spiritual audit. And in an era where personal accountability is often replaced with blame or denial, this kind of honest reflection is not only rare, it is revolutionary. Moreover, the Book of the Dead teaches the principle of Ma'at, the goddess and cosmic force representing truth, balance, order, harmony, and justice. To live in accordance with Ma'at was to live a life of integrity, not because one feared punishment, but because one understood that the universe itself is sustained by balance. Disrupt the balance, and you sow destruction not just in the world, but in your soul. Honor it, and you align yourself with something greater than any individual. You become part of the divine flow of existence. This wisdom is more relevant than ever. We live in a time of immense spiritual confusion. The modern world is materially rich, but spiritually bankrupt. People search for meaning in superficial pleasures, in consumerism, in constant digital stimulation, only to find themselves more anxious, disconnected, and lost than before. The Egyptian Book of the Dead calls us back to a more grounded and ancient truth, that the soul must be nourished just as the body must be fed. A life without spiritual awareness is like walking the duat without spells, blind, vulnerable, and easily led astray. There is also something profoundly humbling in the way the Egyptians approached the afterlife. Despite their elaborate tombs and rituals, the ultimate judgment wasn't based on wealth, social status, or power. It was based on the heart. A rich man who lived dishonestly could have his soul devoured just as easily as a poor farmer. A pharaoh who abused his people could fail the test, while a humble scribe who lived in truth could become Osiris. In this sense, the Book of the Dead offers one of the earliest recorded visions of spiritual equality. All souls, regardless of class or rank, were accountable to the same divine law. That lesson remains just as powerful and necessary today. Beyond morality and judgment, the book offers deep symbolic teachings about transformation. In the duet, the soul must face trials, conquer fears, answer riddles, and battle illusions. These are metaphors for spiritual initiation. Anyone who has endured loss, failure, trauma, or depression knows this path intimately. These are our personal underworlds. And just as the soul in the Book of the Dead must remember who it is and speak truth in the face of terror, so too must we find the courage to rise again after being broken. The book teaches that transformation is not only possible, it is the purpose of life itself. And perhaps most remarkably, the Egyptian Book of the Dead reveals a vision of the soul that is not static, but evolving. The journey does not end with paradise or punishment. It continues. The soul becomes a god, joins the sun, or lives in harmony among the fields of the blessed. It can return to the earth, help others, or dwell in the stars. This dynamic view of the afterlife suggests that consciousness is not limited to a single destination, but is part of a larger, ever-unfolding mystery. It encourages us to think of life and death not as a line with an endpoint, but as a circle, a spiral, a rhythm. In a time when death is feared hidden and avoided at all costs, the Book of the Dead invites us to embrace it, not with despair, but with understanding. It tells us that death is not the opposite of life, but the continuation of it, that we are all part of something vast, interconnected, and divine, and that if we live with awareness, truth, and love, we have nothing to fear from the darkness, for we carry the light within us. So whether you are a spiritual seeker, a philosopher, or simply someone searching for deeper meaning, the Egyptian Book of the Dead has something to offer. It is not just a record of ancient beliefs. It is a timeless guide for the soul, a reminder that the greatest journey we will ever take is not across continents or through time, but within ourselves. And that journey, if we are brave enough to take it, leads not to death, but to awakening.